Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started as this is just a half-an-hour webinar, so we're going to try to keep it on point time-wise. We're really excited to have Adam Satterfield here, who's the VP of QA over at BetterCloud, who's one of our earliest customers here at QASymphony. And Adam's got over 15 years of experience in QA, and he's currently in a very successful Agile environment over at BetterCloud. So we're excited to have him here today to talk about acceptance test-driven development. And our agenda for today's meeting is going to be pretty quick, but we're going to hit on a lot of the high points about ATDD. So first, we're going to talk about some of the common problems that people experience in Agile QA organizations. After talking through those, we're going to kind of suggest the solution here, which would be acceptance test-driven development. We'll talk through that a little bit, what that means, what that looks like, and how Adam's using that at BetterCloud. And we'll talk through some real-world results that Adam experienced when implementing this technique at his organization. And we'll talk through some tips to make sure that you guys don't struggle with if you want to try putting ATDD in your own organization. And then finally, we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to submit those through the questions section of GoToWebinar. You guys are all on mute right now. So if you want to submit those through there, we'll collect those and get to as many as we can at the end. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce Adam, and Adam, you can take it away.
Sure, I appreciate it. Hey, thanks everybody for taking the time today out of your busy schedules to meet with us. So I'd like to start with this quote from Bruce Lee. As you go through and you learn so many different types of principles and methodology for QA, it's important to take those and make them your own. Help them fit into your organization. You're going to listen and hear so many different things, even different ways to do acceptance test-driven development, different ways to do waterfall testing, agile testing. So, make sure that as you're going through this, think about it in terms of how it fits your organization. And if you have questions around that, we're happy to help answer those. So first we want to go over, what really breaks down? Why do you have failures in quality in Agile? Why does QA have troubles in an Agile environment? So the first one here really is, QA is kept out of the loop when it comes to creating the requirements, when it comes to creating the user stories. And really one of the key pieces here is, oftentimes you have a team that has both automation and manual testers. Automation is the last to be notified of functionality. They are the last ones to be brought up to speed. Oftentimes they are, just restricted to only writing regression scripts that will help the next sprint, not necessarily working on functionality that will help the current sprint that you're in. Another thing that we see is, QA doesn't have time to do their acceptance test until after their sprint has started. This causes a large spike in effort for the QA team when a sprint starts to, furiously try to understand the functionality, to try to get in there and really understand, okay, what am I supposed to be testing while I'm creating my test cases in the middle of the sprint. You've got dev and QA out of sync. You have development writing their own unit integration tests. You've got QA writing their own acceptance and system tests, and they're really not working together to find the most efficiencies there. And then lastly, lack of understanding to qualify when QA is done with testing.
Yeah, and Adam, I've talked to a lot of organizations that are in the middle of sort of an Agile transition, or maybe they've completed it already, and I think these are a lot of the key issues that they run into. So I'm excited for you to explain a little bit more in depth here, ATDD, and what that would look like as a solution to these problems.
Yep. So yeah, what we were doing at BetterCloud is TDD, very develop-centric focus testing. You're testing the code here. You're writing your unit test to test individual piece of code. You're writing your integration test to see how that works with the other, third-party software. Very, very valuable. So what we decided to do was build upon TDD with acceptance test-driven development. So where TDD is testing the code, ATDD is testing the product. It outlines what the user should be able to do. It helps to define done with acceptance criteria, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And again, really relying on some of the core principles of Agile. It helps with communication. Communication not only between the business and engineering, but both between dev and QA.
And so, Adam, I know you're going to walk us through here sort of what your typical sprint schedule would look like and how these activities run in parallel between dev and testing and everyone else.
Exactly right. And this is very key to, having a successful sprint to having successful testing, and how to implement ATDD successfully. So it's important to know that when someone's working for a full day, to not book that entire day for just that current sprint work. You need to start working on the sprint planning ahead of time, right? And so you'll see that pretty much, at BetterCloud we use 3-week sprints, but we are very focused on planning for the next sprint as soon as day 2 hits on that current sprint, because we need to get in and we need to define the user stories, acceptance criteria, and acceptance tests for the next sprint, so we know what our backlog looks like. It's very important that sprint planning is a large part of your day-to-day work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, getting into that, I know there's a lot of different sort of information that you need to pass along the way to get that communication going between dev and QA and really formalize that so that people know what they're doing throughout the process. So can you walk us through some of those pieces of information that you guys work on together?
Yep, absolutely. So we start with user stories. I mean, this should be very, understanding for folks who are, in an Agile environment. We use the mountain goat software type of, as a, I want to, so that. Everyone understands that format. It is very, easily approachable by anyone from the business or from QA to understand what is being asked for. And really the point of the user story is to allow the business to explain a business need while allowing the flexibility for, the functionality to be developed in the best way possible. It really allows for open communication, for the functionality to be discussed amongst the team while really removing the need for the business to define those detailed requirements or the acceptance criteria in a silo, because you don't want the business having to have the sole responsibility for defining all of the functionality, defining the negative cases, the boundary scenarios for which that functionality is, supposed to, work. And user stories is that starting place for us.
Great, yeah, and I know from the user stories, right, then we need to talk more specifically about the more detailed acceptance criteria and really how those play into how we're going to test the doneness of this particular user story.
Exactly right. So acceptance criteria, they're the next step. They're how we're going to define done. They are, we take the user story that comes through, which is the business need, and let's define the system behavior around it. Let's make sure that what the business is asking for, that it works as expected, right? It allows us to, understand that story. It allows us to put estimates around that story. It allows us to understand the complexity. And the way that we do it at BetterCloud is we've got, working together as a team, they're primarily led by the QA team. We'll talk about in a few slides the QA team as subject matter experts, where we want to go with that. But, the QA team helps to lead the creation of the acceptance criteria. They direct questions to the development team, to the business team, to understand. Okay, well, I think that this is how we are going to approach this. I think these are all the scenarios. Let's work through this. Let's discuss this. Let's get up and whiteboard the scenarios. And then how does that look? How are based on the user story that we had previously? Let's take a look at some examples on how that would work.
Yeah, and I know here you actually provided some of those examples for us based on that user story we just walked through of what some of the acceptance criteria to qualify that as done might be.
Exactly right. And one thing I want to start the conversation with on this is that you'll see some folks who use acceptance criteria as the test cases. They don't take it to that acceptance test level. And if that works for your organization, that is great. For us, we found that acceptance criteria, they're going to define the scenarios for it. But we are not testing, our test cases are not the acceptance criteria. But if that is something that works for your organization, then, that's great, because a lot of folks, don't like to have the formalized, detailed test cases. They like to just keep it to the scenario level. And we'll talk about in just a minute why we take it to that next level of acceptance testing. But, from the user story that was on the previous slide is, here's some examples, again, defining the scenarios. It allows us to further understand and further take the user story to that next level of complexity.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think we get into, right, the acceptance test, and, you sort of mentioned maybe not all organizations go this far as to use an acceptance test, but, this is kind of bringing the acceptance criteria, right, and turning that into something that's very discrete and very testable.
Exactly right. And there's one of the specific reasons why we use this is for test automation. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but this outlines a clear path on how the product is supposed to be tested. Again, anyone familiar with behavior-driven development, this should look very familiar for you. We use, it's a very simple given, when, then statement, which will allow us to define the flow of the actual test case.
Yep. And so you've got an example here, right, of what one of these might look like?
Exactly right. So, based on the acceptance criteria, we're going to use given to set the state of the system, set the state of the customer. The when here, when the customer clicks on the update billing information, right? So these are the actions that the user is taking. And again, if the user has to take multiple actions within this given statement, we just use and. And so that way you can say when the user does an action and they do another action, then is the actual result that we're looking for. And this is really, anyone familiar with, waterfall type test cases where you've got step 1, step 2, etc. Your then is really your expected result. This is what happens when the user is done taking their actions. And then we're going to take a look and see how does this, work, for both manual and, test automation, because, that's really the key, is having both of those organizations, working solidly together.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I'm excited just to touch quickly here on sort of, I know you guys use JIRA as your development and Agile tracking tool, and you're using QTest as your test case management tool. Can you explain just a little bit the linkage between those two and how you're managing the flow of information and doneness between these two tools?
Yeah, so we use JIRA to track our tasks to create our burn down charts. We use the Agile plugin for JIRA to allow us to track how are we doing on day-to-day process for our sprint. I mean, it's a very classic burn down chart. Anyone familiar with the Agile plugin, this should look very familiar. If you're not, I highly suggest taking a look at that if you use both JIRA in an Agile environment. But we input our user stories, and then from within the user story, we add the acceptance criteria to that ticket. And then from there, we create testing tasks, development subtasks, and then what we do is we go into QTest, and we have JIRA linked together with QTest. So we input our test case as an acceptance test, and then we can run that through QTest, through all the normal, pass, fail, to create a defect ticket in JIRA. And then when that is done, we can update the testing task in JIRA, and that allows us to not only have a system of record for the sprint itself, but a system of record for the actual acceptance test. I mean, we can look back and we can see when they were run, what the scenarios were. So it allows us to, have that, a little bit better searchable, functionality for the actual test cases, which I think JIRA falls a little bit flat on the ability for us to really search through test cases, and that's what, QTest helps us with.
Yeah, and that's great, explanation of those two tools working together. And obviously, there's a lot of different ways you can set those up. But I think you guys have come up with something pretty unique that's a good solution for ATDD. So most importantly, Adam, I think people really want to know the results. We talked about a big problem here in the beginning with Agile QA and sort of getting caught in some of those roadblocks or some of those downfalls that you may have in transitioning to Agile QA. So you guys have successfully implemented ATDD, and it's obviously an iterative process. But so far, what have you seen in improvements in terms of the manual QA side?
Yeah, so for manual QA, I mentioned before, having the QA team be the SMEs. They are the ones in your product day in and day out. And so by bringing them into the process early, by helping them, to define acceptance criteria, to come up with user stories, you allow them to really shine as the SME. They get a chance to, really explain their knowledge and work with a team to help the team understand all the different ways the user can use the system. Another thing we've seen is the acceptance test cases get created during sprint planning. So you don't have this spike in effort at the start of a sprint where QA is trying to create their test cases as well as trying to actually do their testing. Building on that, because that work is done up front, because the team works with both the development team and the business up front, the team can focus on more complex test scenarios. They can work out more complex UAT type tests with the business. They can work out more complex, security testing or performance or load testing with development. It allows them to really work through those test scenarios, whereas before they may only be, able to run through just a few basic acceptance type testing.
Yeah, and obviously manual QA, you said, is just one part of the process. You obviously have an automated QA team at your organization as well. So can you walk through a little bit there what some of the improvements you've seen on the automation side have been after you've implemented this?
Yeah, no doubt. So I want to start real quick and just explain what we use at BetterCloud for our automated cases. So our cases are written in Groovy with a Spock framework. So there's a very specific reason why we do that. Is we'll take a look in a slide in just a minute how these scripts will look, but we can take the given when then format that was created during sprint planning and directly apply that to our automation cases. And what this really does is it reduces the amount of time and adds efficiency to when the functionality has been delivered, so when the automation team can start creating their test cases. So they understand the functionality up front. We've brought the automation team into the sprint planning, so they have the ability to work at that point to start creating their given when then cases. And then using this framework, it will then directly translate into the actual automated scripts.
Yeah, and that's really awesome, to kind of hear about that process. And I'm really interested for you to take a little time here and walk us through sort of what one of these test cases, automated test cases, would look like in Spock, and sort of how easy it might be for a manual tester to understand what's going on here.
Yeah, no doubt. So anyone could be able to take a look at this. This is a snapshot of one of our real automated cases, and understand what is going on here, right? We start with our acceptance criteria, which is just a simple verify statement, and then you see given, when, and then. Very, very basic, very easily to understand. Even someone that does not have automation knowledge can open up the script and say, okay, I understand the point of this script. So it allows us to take the user story flowing into the acceptance criteria in the same format that the manual testers use for their acceptance tests. We can then use for automation tests, which really, it gives us a lot of efficiencies.
Yeah, for sure. And Adam, I think one of the most interesting things that I've learned about BetterCloud and kind of preparing for this webinar is that you guys don't really prescribe to, a goal of trying to automate a certain percentage of your test cases. You kind of focus on using automation, where it can get you the most bang for your buck, and having some creative sort of approaches to that. So can you talk a little bit about this sort of outside-the-box automation philosophy that you have?
Yeah, definitely. I've been hearing, since the late 90s that test automation is going to make manual testing go away. I definitely do not subscribe to that. I believe that you get the most bang for your buck having the manual testers and automation testers work together. And some of the stuff that, in order to have that be successful is you've got to break out of the mold for what some folks believe automation should be, where, you use Cucumber or some version of Selenium, and that is the only thing that you can use. If you can break out of your tool, and if you can break out of the fact that you think automation should only be used for regression scripts, or they should only be used to automate the functionality that you're trying to test directly, you're going to gain a lot more efficiencies, right? And then some of the you're going to gain is when you bring the automation team into the sprint planning process, it allows them to think ahead. It allows them to think about, okay, what are ways that we can gain efficiencies? One of the ways that we were able to do this is we created a Chrome extension. So we have, some functionality where we're going to be changing, a product name from X to Y. So what we want to do is, okay, well, we put a level of testing effort on that for the manual testers. It's going to take 3 weeks to get this done. It's a large effort. You have to go through the entire application, check all the modals, check all, the button names, all the image names. So how can we make that more efficient? So what we decided was, from the automation team, we had a suggestion is like, well, let's create a Chrome extension that will go in, it will parse the DOM, and we can actually take a look. And when it is run, it will put a red box on the screen for any name that is the old name. And then you can take a screenshot of it and then log that as an issue, right? So thinking outside of the box, we were actually able to cut our LOE down by 75% for that project.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool story because obviously all of us as testers, we really are problem solvers and we're very creative, and I really like the way that you guys sort of leverage an out-of-the-box approach there to solve this problem. And so Adam's actually been kind enough to share sort of a screenshot, and he's going to walk us through a little bit about, this tool and sort of how it works and how they decided to arrive at this approach.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions about, how we came up with this, feel free to ask those. Since we've only got 30 minutes, I really can't go into this in depth. So I just wanted to, share a screenshot. Again, I think we probably spent more time debating the name of the actual extension as opposed to actually, getting the test run. So we want that to dominate. So some of our fans just think it's quite silly. But it's very, very, very simple. You can see here the description. On the right-hand side, that is what the actual tester will use. They can run that. It will parse the page. It will then highlight the items in red, and we can log that. It's very, very simple and saves an immense amount of time.
Yeah, and that's really an awesome story. I think I would encourage all of you guys to sort of think about sort of opportunities like this, where you can leverage a tool like this to help accelerate manual testing almost, and see where some of the synergies between the automation and manual teams may lie. So at this point, I'm just going to take a minute here, guys. We've gotten some good questions already, but we're going to be gearing up for Q&A here in about 2 to 3 minutes, and Adam's going to wrap up with some of his high-level tips here that we can take away as we go and try to implement this in our own organization. So please feel free to submit some of those questions now, and I'll start looking through the list and see which ones we can answer. All right, Adam, take it away and kind of give us what your final takeaway tips are.
Sure, yeah, and this is really a recap of some of the stuff that we talked about, right? So again, it is important, especially for an organization that uses both manual and automated testers, to include the test automation team early and often. They understand how the process is supposed to work. They may even understand it because of their development knowledge a bit differently than the manual testers. So include them early and often in sprint planning. To build on that is, don't think inside the tool. Don't think, well, I've got a test team and we've got this tool, so what can we do within the tool? Let's break out of that. Let's see what efficiency can we gain. If we're in a Windows environment, can we do some scripting with PowerShell? If we're using Chrome to do our testing, can we create a Chrome extension tool that will help us gain those efficiencies? One of the core tenets of Agile is communication and collaboration, right? This is going to be the same for acceptance test-driven development. Focus on communication and collaboration. As you're going through and you're discussing the user stories, get in a room with the business, get in a room with development. If you've got some ideas, whiteboard those. Really, put them down. Talk to folks. That if you have a team that is not talking together, not working together, it's going to be very, very hard to implement either Agile or acceptance test-driven development. And again, I believe it is key for both manual and automated testers working together. Have them work together. Have them create acceptance criteria together. Have them create the acceptance test together, especially if you use that given when then format. They're going to be able to be used together. You're going to gain a lot of efficiencies there.
Well, that's great, Adam. I really appreciate all of your insights here. This has been very helpful for me, and we're getting a lot of positive feedback from everyone on the line about this. And so we've got a few questions here, that we want to try to answer. And so the first one that we received was from Daniel was talking more about using ATDD potentially in more of a client-facing relationship. So if you were talking with a client and you were kind of defining requirements with that client, would you, or user stories, I guess, in an Agile case, at what point in the cycle would you say that it would be good to specify acceptance criteria? Would you pull clients in to do that, or would it be sort of defining the user story with the client and then the testing and development teams to work on the acceptance criteria?
That's a really good question. I think it really depends on the client. It depends on the technical knowledge of the client. It depends on the ability for the client to really, break out of the mold. I've found that, working in some previous relationships, that clients find it difficult to create user stories. They don't really quite understand the, as a user, I want to sow that. So really, with the clients, it seems to be a lot easier to focus on what is your business need? What is that need that you're trying to do? And they would probably honestly understand the acceptance criteria more than the user story. So you've got the client need. Go ahead and create that user story and put that in a format that you understand, and then work with the client to try to get an idea for the acceptance criteria. Maybe if you're building an app, they want to have that app, respond within, 3 seconds. They want to have some specific, login functionality, or they have some specific, security requirements or HIPAA requirements. Those are the type of things that would go in your acceptance criteria. So it's probably best to focus on the acceptance criteria with the client than try to shoehorn them into writing user stories.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense for sure. I think that's a good approach to take. So we got another question here from Jason, and he's asking you what are some of the difficulties that you faced in setting this process up for the first time. So, what would you kind of think would be some of the major roadblocks that you experienced in setting this up, or even setting this up in previous organizations with BetterCloud?
I think it's getting everyone on board. One of the challenges that we've had is making the transition from a classic requirements document to working on user stories. Oftentimes is you're going to have the dev team or the dev and QA team be ready for Agile, be ready for acceptance test-driven development, and then you've got the business teams lagging behind a bit, right? So it's going to have to be keep an open mind and understand that as you're making this transition, you're probably going to have some extra work to take those old requirements documents, translate them into user stories, and then kick the process off. I would say that is probably one of the biggest challenges. And the second, when I mentioned sprint planning, it's getting those sprint planning sessions down. As you kick them off early, they're probably going to be a little bit painful to try to understand, okay, at what point do I estimate the user story for complexity? At what point do I estimate the acceptance criteria and acceptance tasks? Do we use planning poker? Do we use, some other different type of, scale for that? So it's really trying to, figure out how do we most efficiently use sprint planning. So I think those are really your two, bringing the business along and then trying to, figure out sprint planning are probably going to be two of your biggest challenges.
Cool. That's definitely good to know. And, as you guys go out and roll this stuff out, those can be things that you kind of stay aware of as you're implementing to make sure you don't get caught up in either of those. One question we have here is about the specifics of ATDD, and if you'd be willing to just sort of explain a couple of the intricacies of how that's really different than BDD as a process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the BDD that we use, being that you're more focused on the user, the behavior of the actual, user going through the product. There's a lot of similarities. I will admit that I blend a lot of those in my testing. So we do have a lot of overlap. I will also admit that I am not a BDD expert. So most of what we take from BDD is that given when-then format. It is the format for understanding how do we step through the application in a specified format. Really with acceptance test-driven development, the main goal, the main focus of that is having the team define those acceptance criteria and then driving those into acceptance tests. Mm-hmm. So, probably not the full detailed answer, but, happy to go into that, in a little bit more detail with you if you want to shoot that question over to me.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're very appreciative of Adam being open to that. I think we have time for about one more question here. We've got a couple minutes left. And Adam, kind of the final question I think that people have and I have for you is sort of what do you see, both inside of BetterCloud and in terms of ATDD in general, and sort of the next frontier of ATDD, and where do you see this heading and evolving towards, if you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I like to see more integration with the automation teams and the manual teams, because we have seen, in so many organizations where folks say, well, we have a need for automation, let's get rid of our manual testers. Or we have a need for manual testing, so I don't really see why we need automated testers, right? So I think really having those two teams work together to really drive efficiencies and, working and using acceptance test-driven development. I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see those organizations, come together where maybe you won't even really have true automated testers and true manual testers. You're going to have testers that really do both.
Yep. And, Adam, I think this has been really great. We really appreciate you coming out and sharing your insights with us. You definitely have a lot of knowledge to share, and we appreciate that you're making yourself available to kind of answer any questions. So, guys, we didn't get to every question today, but if you have some outstanding questions, you can email Adam. His email is adam.satterfield@bettercloud.com here. We'll also be posting the slides as well as the video of this webinar afterwards for you guys to share with anyone on your team who may have missed it. We appreciate you guys all coming out. Please join us again next month. We will be planning on having another webinar, which you guys will hear about shortly. And enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate you guys again, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks.